Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask-strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 983 for December 18th, 2022. Coming up in a few minutes.
I understand a little bit from Jimmy now why he fought so hard, but you know, I try to take what I learned from that situation and improve on it with Bruce, you know, be a little more open about his suggestions and stuff like that. And
as Eddie Russell puts it, what goes around comes around. He's now working with his son Bruce the same way he worked at Wild Turkey with his father, the legendary Jimmy Russell. Eddie's marking his 42nd year of making whiskey, and we'll catch up with him on this week's WhiskyCast In-Depth. I'll also have my tasting notes for Eddie's latest Master's Keep edition, Unforgotten, in the What I'm Tasting This Week department. That's all ahead, along with your voice, behind the label, and more on this week's WhiskyCast.
Hey friends, Gabriel Cardarella here with Dewar's Scotch Whiskey, and I can't wait to introduce you to the new Dewar's 12-year hitting shelves this holiday season. More a little later in this episode of WhiskyCast.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast. Happy holidays! On behalf of Redbreast, here's to you and yours. Eating well, enjoying a redbreast or two, and getting all snug and cosy on the couch. Reminds me of my own nest. Sure, there's no cushions or blankets, but I do have some very fancy decorative twigs, let me tell you. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's get started with the week's news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. And we're starting to get into the light news season now with the holidays coming up, but we do have a few stories to report. Last month, we reported that Lisa Wicker had left Brooklyn's Widow Jane Distillery for a new opportunity. We now know what that new opportunity is, and it comes with the title of CEO. She's been named to head up Lyons Brewing and Distilling, Alltech's new umbrella organization that oversees Lexington Brewing and Distilling, along with the Pierce Lyons Distillery in Dublin, Ireland, and the Lyons family's other brewing interests. Another distillery expansion to report this week, this one in Scotland, where Bacardi will invest £15 million to double production at Altmore Distillery in the Highlands. Altmore is bottled as a single malt, but most of its production goes into blends. In fact, there will be a special single malt to mark the distillery's 125th anniversary this year. It'll be available through the Dewar's World of Whiskey shop at Aberfeldy Distillery and the Dewar's website. If you're looking for something to do over the holidays, the producers of the Water of Life Scotch Whiskey documentary have released an extended cut version of the film. There's an extra 10 minutes of previously unseen footage that's not part of the version now showing on PBS. The extended version is available to watch only at the film's website, wateroflifefilm.com. Let's hope whoever spent $52,500 for a single bottle of Pappy Van Winkle 23-year-old the other day at Sotheby's doesn't get a case of buyer's remorse. The auction set a record for the highest price ever paid for a bottle of Pappy after the winning bidder got into a bidding war with another collector/investor. Sotheby's had estimated the value of that bottle at $3,000 to $4,000 before the auction, in line with other similar auctions in the past. And finally, congratulations to longtime friend of WhiskyCast, Alan Winchester, and the Glen Turret's Bob Delgarno. Both were named to Whiskey Magazine's Hall of Fame this past week. Alan recently retired from Pernod Ricard after a long career as the Glenlivet's master distiller, while Bob is in his second career at the Glen Turret after years as the Macallan's lead whiskey maker. Bob is also one of the few people I've wanted to interview over the years who has consistently stonewalled me. Seems he doesn't like doing interviews, but if that changes, I'm ready to talk when you are, Bob. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com and on our social media timelines. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
Time now for the calendar of events presented by Catoctin Creek Distilling. The Scotch Malt Whisky Society's Canadian chapter has a tasting at Calgary's Kensington Wine Market on January 6th to kick off the new year. The Harrow Whisky Festival in London is January 6th and 7th at the Grimsdyke Hotel. The Arctic Whisky Festival is January 14th in Tromsø, Norway. The Edmonton MS Whisky Festival is January 18th, followed the next night by the Calgary MS Whisky Festival. We'll have special coverage from Victoria, British Columbia of the Victoria Whisky Festival, January 19th through the 22nd. The National Whisky Festival is January 21st in Glasgow, Scotland, and the Bergen Beer and Whisky Festival is January 27th and 28th in Bergen, Norway. Right now, we have more than 130 whiskey events for the coming year on the calendar at WhiskyCast.com. If you're organizing a whiskey event, let us know about it, and we'll be glad to add it to the list. The calendar is brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of the Virginia Rye Whiskey. You'll find their Roundstone Rye at fine whiskey shops in 26 U.S. states, 3 continents, and online. Visit the new buyvirginiarye.com site for more details, and please drink responsibly.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast. Not to throw shade on other holiday gifts, but gift cards, really? First, you can't pour, sip and share them. And second, they're so small that you can easily forget about them. Wait, do people say that about me? Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlock and the Classic Malts lineup. Eddie Russell has been making whiskey for 42 years at Wild Turkey. Any place else and he'd be a legend in his own right. But when you're the son of Jimmy Russell and your own son is following in your footsteps, well, Eddie's gotten used to his place on the family tree. Still, the second-generation Bourbon Hall of Famer is cranking out winner after winner, including his latest Russell's Reserve and Wild Turkey Master's Keep editions. I spent some time on a Zoom call this week with Eddie to catch up. First of all, how you been, Eddie? What have you been up to these days?
Working with Bruce pretty closely anymore. Not traveling as much. He's letting the brand ambassadors do that. So, Bruce has been promoted to associate blender. So, working with him on new projects, just getting him used to how to pick out barrels and things like that.
Has he already started challenging you the way you did with Jimmy?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. What goes around comes around. You know that.
How is Jimmy doing?
He's doing good. He still comes out to the visitor center 3 or 4 days a week and sits around and chats with people and signs bottles. So he's doing pretty good. He can't get around too well, but that won't stop him from going to the distillery.
I don't think anything can keep him away from the place.
No, there's nothing that I know of that could for sure.
So what's it like working with your son now after years of working with your dad?
It is, I understand a little bit from Jimmy now why he fought it so hard. But, I try to take what I learned from that situation and improve on it with Bruce, be a little more open about his suggestions and stuff like that. And it's a little different for me because I realize Bruce is, he's the person that age, that person that gets out in the bar scene that we're really trying to connect to. So his information is valuable to me. I still have to fight him on everything needs to be right, but it's definitely interesting, and he's really worked hard this year. So it's pretty neat to see.
Now, what's the path for him from associate blender? Where does he go from here?
Well, probably do a little schooling. He didn't get to start out in the distillery like I did. He started at a brand ambassador in Austin. So probably some distillation courses, maybe online, just working closer to distillery. He's lived here in Louisville for a couple of years, but still spent most of his time out on the road as a brand ambassador. So he's working really closely with the single barrel program. That helps him understand the different flavors coming from the different floors and the different warehouses. And then just working around the distillery. He's spending a lot of time here asking questions, not only working with me, but working with the distillery personnel, just looking things over, getting a feel for exactly what has to be done.
Let's talk about, first of all, the new Russell's Reserve, the single Rickhouse from Camp Nelson C. Single Rickhouse is an unusual term. How did you guys decide to come up with that one? Because that's not one we'd used before for a whiskey.
Yeah, it really come forth through our barrel program. I really enjoyed the basically 10 years that I did the single barrel program and was amazed at how all the warehouses have a typical different taste profile. We've had some that people just thought were amazing and still hunt for all the time. And, I think that's what started. And we had to tear down Warehouse C at Camp Nelson due to deterioration. It basically had a sinkhole under, and we tried for years to fix it back and forth because I really love those warehouses up there. But as we brought the whiskey out, we had a company that actually took the barrels out as they were tearing it down, and we got to taste each individual. It just seemed the perfect time to use some of that great liquid that we found in there to do the single Rickhouse. It's only 72 barrels, so it's something that's very limited, very rare, and wound up finding some really crazy tasting whiskey that I just thought hit my taste profile with that sort of toffee, coconut, really silky finish on it. As Bruce always says, he knows my taste profile, and it sort of hit on all those notes.
Now, how were you dealing with that Rickhouse for years with a sinkhole underneath it?
Well, we had construction come in and work on it. We moved barrels out of the way a couple of times, and it just got to the point that, it wasn't structurally at this point, but it was getting to that point. We'd poured concrete in, we'd done a lot of different things, but it was just a losing battle. We couldn't keep things. You're sitting so high above the Kentucky River, and I always thought, sooner or later we'll hit that big shelf of rock, but it seemed like under this one, we never did get to that point. So basically it got to the point where structurally, we keep plumb bobs in all of our warehouses, and structurally we just thought it was time to do away with it.
What happens to that site now if you can't use it because it's got a sinkhole underneath it?
Yeah, we won't replace it. We'll just, instead of 6, we'll have 5 warehouses up there, all the new warehouses right there at Tyrone. Easier for us to deal with. That's about an hour drive and a tractor trailer, and for the employees to go up there. Hope we always have the 5 that we have because they produce some amazing whiskey, but no reason to rebuild there. We'll just rebuild at Tyrone.
Now, what about Camp Nelson makes it unique? What about those 5 warehouses lends to good whiskey?
Honestly, I think it's the air circulation. There's not a thing around them anymore. They sit way high up on a cliff over the Kentucky River. A lot of them have sort of valleys on the edges of them where that air flows through there. And I think that's probably the biggest reason. Just nothing to impede the air circulation around all of them. They're not close together. They're spread out a little bit. So it gives each one of them sort of some of the things that I see the warehouses in Tyrone, like G, where nothing's really around it, produces some great whiskey. And I think all 5 of them are in the same situation.
Are there any other warehouses that are in danger of having to be cleared out?
Not at Camp Nelson. We have a couple at Tyrone that are getting pretty iffy. But, you think about it. We built one, I think, in 2003, and that was the first one that had been built in over 25 years in Kentucky. So all these warehouses were built in the 40s, the 50s, a few in the 60s. So they're very old. You're in and out. Back in the day when I started, they all had those sort of tar and paper roofs on them, and the main thing for a warehouse is keeping the water out of them. Now all of them have tin roofs, so it's a little bit easier. Of course, with us, the way Jimmy taught us, opening those windows in the summertime to let that air circulate, you get a little water in there when it rains in Kentucky. So those type things you constantly got to be on top of. And maybe for years we weren't as on top of them as we should have been. But now we take care of them. But there's a couple of them. Some of the old warehouses there at Tyrone we're looking at real hard right now because after you spend so much money on them and we have so much land here to build new ones, it's you sort of weigh the option of how much money we're spending versus a new one.
How many new ones are you building these days?
Basically, one a year is what we've been doing. We built a couple 50,000 barrel warehouses that I was super excited about when they came to me and talked to me about it because I could work out of both ends, but it needed some tweaking. Nobody really done it, as far as a regular metal clad warehouse. I know there were some old brick ones that held that many barrels, but when I first built the first one, when I walked in, checking on it is probably year and a half down the road. There was so much moisture on that bottom floor. We had so many barrels, so we had to go back and do a little more venting. Jimmy, he doesn't like any air fans in the top of his warehouses, so it has to be all natural. So basically, had to bring them back in and do a lot more venting to keep. There's just so much moisture during the summertime to do evaporation and stuff. With those 50,000, it was just sort of overwhelming on the first floor.
That's what I've been wondering because a lot of distilleries have been building these big 50,000 barrel warehouses. And I'm wondering if it does make a difference down the road if we're going to get different tasting bourbon from these big brick houses.
I definitely think you're going to still see some of the normal things at the top and the middle, but I think at the bottom you're definitely going to see a lot more of those earthy floral tones. That's not always my favorite. They're good to blend with, but definitely a little more moisture down there. So you're going to, your proof's going to go way down. You're going to have some more of them really earthy floral type tones.
Let's switch over to the latest Master's Keep edition, Unforgotten. This is an ode to the old Unforgiven, right?
Exactly. I love that stuff. I thought it was
so
amazing. From day one, it took me about 3 years to convince the company to actually put it in a bottle, and it was mainly because the guy that run Australia wanted it so bad. And I always sort of had in the back of my mind that, if we could come out with a new release of it. Rye just got so hot. I mean, it was one of those things you come out with Forgiven, and all of a sudden everybody wants rye, and we went from 2 days a year to 3 or 4 days a month now making rye. So finally starting to catch up a little bit where I could keep some back. I don't know that we'll ever release Forgiven as a permanent, and then of course putting our own spin. This was one that Bruce really, really worked hard on because, he is the rye guy. And, my main thought was my part was get the older bourbon, which I love. So it's got some 13-year-old bourbon in it, which to me is just that 13, 14, 15. It's where I look for most things. And then some 9-year-old rye that Bruce picked out and putting it together in barrel, putting it at 105 proof, non-chill filter, just doing the things that we should do with it.
And we should explain what Unforgiven was. That was the result of a mistake a few years ago, right?
Yeah. I thought me and the girl that did it were both going to get fired. Jimmy was so mad. It was 6 months worth of rye for us. Back then, we didn't have much rye. We didn't make it but 2 days a year, and we basically dumped it twice a year, once in the spring and once in the fall. And it was the whole 6 months worth, and she accidentally pumped it in on top of some 6-year-old bourbon. So you had 6-year-old bourbon and 4-year-old rye. But like I said, when I first went and tasted it, I just loved it. It came in with that sort of bourbon flavor and then left you with that great rye taste on the back end. I just thought it was fantastic. And we did a second batch of it. People still are always looking for those bottles. And this was just sort of a way to upgrade it. I think this one definitely is more rye forward when you taste it instead of that bourbon coming in on top. But, something we always try to do here at Wild Turkey, and something I really preach to Bruce a lot is balance. Balancing the front taste to the middle taste to the finish. And I think Unforgotten really hit all those marks.
How do you decide what goes into a Master's Keep edition? Is it your call? Is it marketing's call? Is it a collaboration? How do you decide?
So we all sit down together for, ever so often and we talk about things. Some of them are so crazy that it's not what Wild Turkey's about. And some of them are really good ideas, but you always have things. I mean, if you look at our Masters Keep series, some of them were just me, like the 17-year-old. Some of them were Bruce, like the 11-year-old Rob. But a lot of the stuff we do is to pay homage to Jimmy because he's the one that built this wild turkey business for us. So, doing things like the bottled and bond, which he did one time, and doing different things like doing where my taste profile and his taste profile together. Now, doing the finishes, we sort of leave that part out because, Jimmy, he didn't believe in doing finishes. Nobody ever did finishes until Lincoln Henderson decided to do it to make something a little bit different. But it's just a different consumer nowadays. I mean, you have these young people that are always looking for something new, something exciting. And even the collectors, if you just, we at the beginning we had a little older whiskey and everybody's like, just keep doing older. And I'm like, we can't just keep doing older. We got to do things that are new and refreshing, which has been cool. Now the Masters Keep series is, as it's got to this point, you sort of run out of ideas. I like to keep them. Most of them is Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. And, when you're doing finishes, that's not exactly what they are. And you're doing the blending of rye bourbon. So this series will probably end a few years down the road and we'll pick up something else. This Rickhouse series for the Russells, it's, truly amazing. So we'll come up with something for the Wild Turkey. So we're working on that now. And with Bruce, I got a lot of fresh ideas that for that younger generation throws around. So it's pretty cool to see the evolution of what's going on.
What kind of ideas does Bruce bring to the table for you?
Well, he just has different thoughts that we really never had. I was always into non-chill filtration. That's why I did the single barrel program that way with the Russells. He's more into those higher proofs, and it's really a difficult thing for me because, I grew up in the era where 101 was too strong for most people. And now people are looking for 120, 130 proof. And I'm just different. I enjoy, Booker was Jimmy's best friend. And when he come out with his first release of Booker's, it was like, it was so strong I couldn't taste it. It's one of the few whiskeys I had to add water to get the flavors out of it. So I don't want to hit that point, but I do want to make sure that the people out in the market that are looking for these natural barrel proofs that we get in, of course, our barrel proof's a little higher than it was back in the day when I was picking most all the barrels. And, we'd run into 110, 112 proof. Now we're running into that 118 to 125 proof by barreling at 115. So it's a little bit different, but it's definitely something the market's looking for, and that's something valuable to me. Is it's always for me been about bringing more people into the bourbon industry, and I think right now Wild Turkey with our portfolio from the 101 and Rare Breed to the Russells to the Long Branches, we have something for everybody.
Explain how barrel proof makes a difference when you're going into the barrel at 125 proof versus say 105 proof. What did you go in at before?
So we did 107 up until 2004. I mean, you couldn't even put it in the barrel higher than 110 until the early 60s. I think Seagram's company had that changed to 125. So everybody was doing 110 or less. You don't add water, so you don't take away too much flavor. Now, I think at 125 in the barrel, from what we've seen, we've done a little bit just for experiment. You pull out some bitterness of that wood that we're not looking for. We tried 110, and I liked it a lot, but I still was having trouble getting the proof for the Rare Breed, and that's really what sort of changed everything. When Jimmy came out with Rare Breed with 6'8", 12-year-old, I mean, I was having to steal all the top floor stuff just to make it, to get it to 108, 109 proof. So all of my older stuff got below 100. I had to even stop doing a 12-year-old 101 proof in Japan because I didn't have anything when it got older that was 101 proof. So we're back now with the 115. We think that's just a perfect proof to put in there to keep the flavors without that wood sort of imparting that bitterness to it.
Did that have anything to do with the decision to release the Wild Turkey 81 proof a few years ago?
No, the 81 really for me, that was a decision for me to bring it more in line with our 101. We always had a 4-year-old 80 proof that Jimmy came out with, and that was sort of, your company pushing. We want to sort of compete with these Jim Beams and these other guys that are 80 proof 4-year-old. But for me, as I was growing up and became drinking age, Jimmy would go into bar and see the 4-year-old 80 proof, and he'd just drink iced tea. And I've seen it a few times, and I'm like, Jimmy, why aren't you drinking the 80 proof? And he's like, it needs to be at least 6-year-old. So when I come up with 81 proof, that's what it was about for me, was getting it more in line. So we do put a little 5 in there, but it's got that 6, 7, 8-year-old in there. That just brings it more in line with our 101 proof. The best thing about that was when I stepped up and at the very beginning and said, this is a very mixable bourbon. Jimmy didn't like that too much because, for him, mixed bourbon is ice cube in it. So, but for me, again, it was about bringing it in line, but it was also about bringing more people in the category, understanding the bartenders, even at that time, thought, they loved 101, but for a lot of the newcomers, it was just too big and bold for them. So giving them something that was aged enough to have good flavors where they could make a cocktail with it.
What else is coming in Russell's Reserve? When might you come out with the next edition of a single Rickhouse?
So right now, hopefully planning on doing one a year. So there'll be a new one coming out next year, and it's going to be a warehouse that the single barrel groups just go gaga over. During doing the single barrels, you can't pick your warehouses. You have to look to the ones that have the right ages, the right flavors, and it's been amazing to me during my career to see, and it opened up my mind so much to see how much difference there was in locations for your warehouses. So, I had some favorites. We had some that were just crazy, not even what you think of with Wild Turkey with these red berries. And we've had some that just have what I call just classic great bourbon whiskey. And that seems to be what, most of the people were looking for, something that had a lot of flavor, a lot of big, bold taste to it. And so a new one will be coming out next year. We've already worked on that. We're already looking at other warehouses for the next series. And I think that was sort of a big surprise to Bruce is how far out in advance we start on these things. I'm not the guy that we have an idea and we put out a product in 2 months. Most of these things take a couple years for me because I want to make sure. I've got him in there tasting different barrels and then putting them together and tasting what they taste like together to try to show him, what you're looking for and what can go together to give you certain flavors. And that's what the blending process has always been about. Our distillery has always been big on the one recipe and using the best grains and one yeast, and all that stuff matters in making a consistent 101 product. But for me, seeing how different all the barrels was really an eye-opener for me. So then coming along and seeing how each warehouse sort of has different flavor profiles was really something that sort of woke me up to this is something that people just love. So we'll definitely try to do it once a year. It'll always be a very limited number. Once it's gone, it's gone. Some of the other stuff like the 13-year-old, we try to release a little bit every year. But this will be something when that warehouse is done, it's done.
It sounds to me like you're still learning stuff about whiskey.
Every day. I think that's what's always kept Jimmy involved is you just constantly learn. I still go to him. I'm 42nd year of making whiskey, and I still go to him and go, you ever seen this or you ever seen that? And it's funny because a lot of times oh, that don't happen, because Jimmy was very simple in his descriptors of his whiskey and stuff like that. But, understanding why something here might be different from there. And he just has so much knowledge, so learning. And that's what I try to preach to Bruce is, we're never going to change what Jimmy built, but there's just so much stuff you keep learning day in and day out. After 42 years, I'm not sure there's another industry you could still be learning after 42 years, but this is definitely one of them.
Thanks to Eddie Russell for spending some time with us this week on WhiskyCast In-Depth. It's brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Let's start off with the new Wild Turkey Master's Keep Unforgotten. It's bottled at 52.5% ABV, and the nose has touches of caramel, fresh apples and peaches, honey, vanilla, and hints of spice and charred oak. The taste combines fresh fruits with baking spices and a toffee sweetness underneath with just a hint of cherries. The finish is long and spicy with a nice underlying fruitiness. It lives up to its name. You won't be forgetting this one anytime soon. I'm scoring the Wild Turkey Master's Keep Unforgotten a 95. Eddie brought up Booker's bourbon during our conversation, and I just happened to receive a sample this week of the final Booker's release of 2022. Pinky's batch is named for Booker No's father, though no one knows how he got the nickname Pinky to begin with. It's bottled at 61.2% ABV, and the nose has touches of red apples, fresh berries, honey, and caramel candy. The taste is thick and chewy with a slow buildup of black pepper and chili powder spices. Apples and cherries linger in the background, along with a touch of cocoa. The finish is long and spicy with hints of chocolate-covered cherries, and I'm scoring Booker's Batch 2022-04, Pinky's Batch, a 92. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit, a 100-time award-winning Maryland-style rye whiskey. With a determined focus to create the best rye whiskey imaginable, Sagamore's team of distillers crafts each spirit with a nod to both tradition and innovation. Find their signature, double oak, cask strength, or reserve series of ryes, as well as their line of premium rye whiskey canned cocktails at a retailer near you. Just visit sagamorespirit.com/find-rye. Please drink responsibly. The folks at Whiskey Del Bach in Tucson, Arizona, are courting a cease and desist letter from the Scotch Whisky Association with their latest release. I'm kidding, of course, but Ode to Isla isn't a peated single malt. It's what they call a heavily mesquited malt, finished in ex-bourbon barrels and bottled at 55% ABV. The nose has, as you might expect, a lot of mesquite smoke, along with touches of cocoa beans and garden soil. The taste starts off with vanilla, as the mesquite smoke builds up gradually to a nice peak, with touches of Christmas spices and toffee, along with hints of peaches and apricots in the background. The finish has lingering spices and mesquite smoke with those same hints of peaches and apricots. I'm scoring Whiskey Del Bach's Ode to Isla a 91. Finally, let's look at the latest release in Aberfeldy's Red Wine Collection, the 18-year-old Tuscan cask finish. This one is bottled at 43% ABV. The nose has notes of raspberries, red grapes, dried flowers, and a soft oakiness. The taste is fruity and floral with raspberries, strawberries, dried flowers, and hints of caramel and vanilla. The finish is long and fruity with just a hint of oak. I'm scoring the Aberfeldy 18-year-old Tuscan cask finish a 92. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 3,400 whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at WhiskyCast.com.
Gabriel Cardarella again, here to tell you about the all-new Dewar's 12-year-old Scotch whiskey. Crafted by Dewar's 4-time IWSC Master Blender of the Year, Stephanie McLeod, the new Dewar's 12-year is now double-aged in first fill premium bourbon casks. It's full of red apples and peaches on the nose, hints of lemon zest and floral notes and subtle spice that'll expand into an incredibly lush, fruity character before you hit that long, creamy finish full of butterscotch and vanilla. It's no wonder that Mark and the good folks at WhiskyCast gave this whiskey a 94-point rating. Just what you'd expect from the world's most awarded blended Scotch whiskey, Dewar's.
Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, presented by Scarabus Isla Single Malt Scotch Whiskey. I mentioned on social media earlier this week that Eddie Russell would be joining us on the show, and Bo Garrett at Firebird Bo on Twitter leads tours at Wild Turkey. This was his response. The man, the myth, the legend. If you love Wild Turkey, Eddie is a big reason why. Thanks, Bo. I shared some photos on social media from a visit to Altmore Distillery several years ago, following the news that it's being expanded, and Gary at Kilted Drammer on Twitter tweeted this. My sister owns a house about 10 minutes drive away from it, yet I've never been over to see it. Must correct that. I responded, you'll enjoy the view from the outside since it's not open to visitors. And Gary came back with this tweet, haha, Mark, that's pretty much like every distillery I visit. I've been to around 80 plus and only been in about 20%. Amy doesn't let me in most because I'll spend money. I'm not touching that one. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always look for me on social media. Just check for WhiskyCast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, or you can email me. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your Voice is presented by Scarabus Isla Single Malt Scotch Whiskey.
I'm Jennifer Tate from Hunter Lane and Company, and we'd like to wish you and your family a happy festive season. Our Scarabus Isla Single Malt Scotch Whiskey makes the perfect holiday gift for toasting by the fireplace. Seek it out at Total Wine and More stores in the US and fine whiskey shops worldwide. Scarabus, only those who seek shall find.
Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the science, history, and people who make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. I mentioned Altmore Distillery earlier during the show. It's one of those distilleries that deserves a lot more attention than it gets, largely because most of its output goes to blending and very little gets bottled as a single malt. Production started there back in 1897, 125 years ago this year. And the Malt Whiskey Yearbook tells us that the founder was one Alexander Edward, who also owned the Benrinnes Distillery and was a co-founder of Craigellachie. In 1923, he sold the distillery to John Dewar and Sons for the whopping price of £20,000. The distillery eventually became part of the DCL stable along with the rest of Dewar's until 1998, when Diageo sold Dewar's and its distilleries to Bacardi for $1.1 billion. Right now, the team at Altmore does 16 mashes a week and produces around 3 million liters of alcohol a year. That is set to double with the planned expansion. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of all of our past episodes that goes all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address, comments@whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast. Mark, how are you, buddy? A quick thank you for letting me loose on WhiskyCast this past year. Oh, cheers for letting Dave tag along too. And happy holidays from all of us at Redbreast. We'll see you in Cork again soon, but until then, sláinte. proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Me again, Gabe with Dewar's, encouraging you to seek out the new Dewar's 12-year-old and experience it for yourself. Until next time, friends, we wish you all the best from everyone here at Dewar's, and please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2022, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening, and have a very merry holiday season.